Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on water access in farm worker communities. I am Mayra Ryder, Project Director with Farmworker Justice. Our presenter today is Maritza Mendoza, Water Equity and Ocean Programs Advocate with GreenLatinos. If you have any questions for her during her presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will also have discussion in breakout groups right after the presentation, and we're going to provide a set of guiding questions to help move the discussion forward. Thank you very much for joining, and now I will turn it over to Maritza.
Hi, thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to share my screen. Nice. Great. So yeah, my name is Maritza Mendoza. I am with Green Latinos, and I'm really excited to talk about water access within farm worker communities today. So I'll just get started. So this is just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'll talk a little bit about Green Latinos and our water equity program, and then talk about some barriers to water access within farm worker communities and what Green Latinos is doing at the national level. And then I'll end with some gaps and promising strategies. So yeah, so first I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. As I said, my name is Maritza, and while I grew up in the United States, my family is from Mexico, and I was really fortunate enough to study environmental science, marine science, but I always like to remind myself that my love for the environment and the care that I see um, and the importance of caring for our environment comes from my family. So these are just a picture of my mom leading us in giving thanks to this tree that was in the park we were walking along. And then on the right is my grandfather, who was a farm worker, up until the last few weeks of his life. And he was also a migrant farm worker who came to California and Oregon to work in the apple orchards and did a lot of what we'll be talking about today. But I think it's just important to to acknowledge how many of our farm workers do a lot of the work they do to make sure that their families and future generations have more opportunities. And they're doing a lot of sacrifices for the betterment of other people. And so I know farm workers have unique stories, but I just wanted to highlight that one. And so this brings me to Green Latinos. Green Latinos is proud to bring together an active comunidad of Latino, Latina, Latinx champions in various environmental sectors and policy sectors. But what I really love about Green Latinos is that we are rooted in the wisdom and power of our culture. And we are always trying to not just share our resources and share connections with one another so that we're able to win our various environmental conservation and climate justice battles, but we are also just gathering to share our stories and to let each other know that we are not alone. And so Green Latinos works on the doing a lot of federal advocacy, and we have a variety of policy priorities. But we always try and make sure that environmental justice and civil rights is embedded in our policies. And so today I'm just going to give a brief overview of our water equity program. So we believe that people have a right to access clean, reliable, and affordable water for drinking, recreation, economic stability, and community health. And We do this in a variety of ways, but we really try to remember how intersectional water is and understand the role of water in our various movements. We also are really aware of how many of our Latinx, low income, and rural communities do not have access to safe and affordable drinking water. And so, as we're doing our advocacy work, we want to make sure that our communities are heard and are prioritized in national policies. And then lastly, we also realize that our response to our water crises is in a state of emergency. So the pandemic really further highlighted how important water is and how many of us do not have access to clean water. So as we are doing our work at GreenLatinos, we really try to make sure that our solutions are addressing the emergency that is happening right now. So moving forward to talking more specifically about farm workers, I just wanted to start with this piece of artwork at first. So this is art from Narciso Martinez, who is a mixed media artist and former farm worker in Washington, Long Island, and California. And I just want to highlight something that he said. He said, I've been collecting vintage labels from produce, and there's always this beautiful scenery with children or women or men. And there's no trace of how hard it is to produce the food and who the people are who are behind this produce. Even now, a lot, if not all of the boxes that I've been collecting are pretty boxes, but there's no trace of farm workers. So I just felt like this was a really clear representation of why a lot of our farm workers are facing so many barriers today. Their stories and their lives have been erased in many ways, and many of us do not have connections to farm workers, and we are unaware of, who is growing our food. And so I just want us to remember, as we're moving forward and coming up with solutions, how do we keep sharing these stories of our farm workers. And I do believe that art has a very important role to play here, not just on sharing these stories, but on imagining the future that farm workers deserve. And another thing that I want to mention here is that when I'm talking about water access, I'm not just talking about drinking water or water so that we can cook, but it's also good sanitation systems, so having toilets or showers that are reliable and affordable. Okay, so here are some of the barriers that farm workers face for water access. And I just want to start off that there are really strong determinants of equitable water access. So with the data that we have, it is clear that race or ethnicity play a big role on who has access to water, and also the socioeconomic status of folks. So Black and Latinx households lack access to complete plumbing at twice the rate of white counterparts. And it shouldn't really be that surprising why this is the case. And to dig deeper on why this is true, that would be a whole other presentation. But I just want to highlight how, as we're moving forward, we really do have the data already that shows who we need to be prioritizing as we're thinking about water access and how to improve and close that gap. And so going forward, a lot of our farm workers live in areas where water infrastructure is unreliable and unsafe. And there are many reasons why that is the case. Some of them we have just talked about, but there's also a lot of rural areas do not have the funding or resources to have good infrastructure. And there are also farm workers there could be a lot of reasons why they live really close to rural areas, which are often close to farms, right? They have very demanding jobs. It might have to be close. Also, immigration status can determine how far folks want to travel. So I won't go into all of those details right now, but I really just want to illustrate how farm workers, the barriers they face are very intersectional. And so our solutions need to address many of these barriers together. So for example, if you don't have clean water at home, right, then that's bad enough, right? That's not really good for your health. But then when we think about uh, the working conditions that farm workers face, the need for water is even greater, and that barrier is greater. As we heard yesterday, many employers don't encourage water breaks, and farm workers often don't feel like they can take those breaks because the way they earn income is very much related to how much they can work, right? And so working in the sun, not having a lot of shade, um, and also working along with pesticides is really clear why we need water, right, at work as well on farms. And so, as we're thinking about solutions, it's important to not just think about how do we get a housing for farm workers that has reliable water, that has good infrastructure, but how do we make sure that when they're working, they also have access to water and they're also able to stay hydrated, and wash their hands before they eat. And so again, just really want to point out how our solutions have to be very intersectional. And as we know, climate change is making these impacts and conditions a lot worse. And not only because it affects like the amount of water that there is, or what kind of water is available, but also it represents job loss, right? If farm workers aren't able to work, then they're not able to make an income. So how do we address that as well as climate change keeps getting worse, right? And so this is some of what GreenLatinos is doing at the federal level. We are trying to make sure that with recent funding, so there is this bill that just passed maybe 6 months ago called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And so this funding represents a huge investment in water infrastructure that we haven't seen in a while. And we're trying to make sure that this funding reaches our most disadvantaged communities, our most vulnerable communities. And so a lot of this funding is going to be distributed through state revolving funds, which is a program that each state has their own priorities, has their own ways of handling this money that comes from the federal government. And so, in this bill, there's money for water infrastructure and addressing other pollution and other contaminants that affect our water quality. And we're, again, really trying to make sure that that money reaches who it needs to reach. And we're currently creating toolkits or working with different community organizations to make sure that they have the resources to apply for this funding and also have the technical assistance to understand what kinds of technical work needs to be done to improve infrastructure. And we're also trying to make sure that this funding through this bill, when we're talking about vulnerable communities, that funding is distributed in the form of grants or in the form of forgivable loans, principal forgiveness, right? So we don't want this funding to further burden communities that are already lack a lot of resource and funding to do this work on their own. And so we're currently trying to make sure that this funding reaches those who need it the most. And we're also working to include more funding for climate resilience through the Build Back Better Act. But additionally, we have been working with the Biden administration on making water more affordable. So, during the pandemic, we saw how important water is again, and how many people weren't able to pay for their water because of job loss and other economic insecurities. And so we worked with the administration to pass the Low Income Water Emergency Assistance Program. And what we really provided guidance on is making sure that people could access this funding regardless of residency, regardless of citizenship status, right? We know that a lot of farm workers do not have are undocumented or are on short-term visas, and we wanted to make sure that they were able to access this funding and wouldn't be left out of this support during the pandemic. And so we're trying to make sure that this program keeps getting funded. We're trying to make sure it gets funded through this low income water assistance program, which is through the EPA. And we're hoping that while it was approved, we're hoping that it gets more funding for the 2023 budget. And so, yeah, I just wanted to end on some data gaps that I've seen. So there is a lot of missing information when it comes to farm workers. There isn't one national entity that collects or tracks progress towards universal water and sanitation access, right? And so that makes it really hard to track the challenges and develop good solutions. And another reason why there might be data gaps is because a lot of farm workers, as I said, are undocumented. And so there is a lot of fear around speaking about their situations or seeking support. And so, as we're working to address this gap and trying to get more information, how do we do that in ways that doesn't further burden our farm workers? How do we make sure that we're addressing this fear and maybe thinking about who we need to partner with that has already has trust with farm workers, right? So just making sure that we are not further burdening our farm workers as we're trying to address these challenges. And some other key takeaways, I think, are that farm workers' health and well-being, as I said before, lie at many intersections of climate and environmental justice movements and public health issues. The inequities that farm workers face clearly show the consequences of overexploiting people and overexploiting the environment. So how do we keep all of those things in mind as we're addressing farm workers' health and making sure that they have what they need to not just survive, but to thrive, right? And so some promising practice that I've heard about are just how do we make sure to shift away from the current industrial agricultural practices that are seen. How can we advocate for and prioritize solutions that promote more diverse and sustainable farming practices, right? Maybe we should be following more Indigenous leaders and really advocating for Indigenous knowledge. And how do we bring that into the conversation and follow the lead of folks who have been stewarding this land for millennia. Also, not only will this support creating practices that don't harm the environment, but they also will support people, right, if we're able to make these shifts. And currently there is a farm bill that is being written or reworked right now. This farm bill, I believe, gets updated maybe every 5 years. But I think this is a big opportunity at the federal level to really write legislation and policies that promote these practices that move away from some of the more harmful extractive agricultural practices that we see. And so I think that those are some of the things that I've seen could be good opportunities to change these systems and not just think about all of these issues in single ways, but how do we work together to address many of these barriers um, in in multiple ways. And so with that, um, these are some guiding questions, but I will first just share my contact information in case there's more questions or more clarity needs to be given. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Maritza, for that great presentation. I will share my screen with you. We are going to go into breakout rooms for a discussion. But before we do that, I would like to see if anyone has any questions for our presenter. If you do, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll take 1 or 2 minutes to answer those. But while people are typing in the chat, we have a comment from Sarah who mentions that HHS is requesting comments that are due tomorrow on environmental justice issues that they should focus on. And she has provided the link for us there. So thank you very much, Sarah. If any one of you are interested, please follow the link to get more information.
I will definitely take a look at that link that you provided, and maybe we can connect after this presentation, and I can give you some more details about maybe what I would I would ask.
Thank you. And one more question. What is the impact of agricultural pollution, including from CAFOs, on water quality in farm worker communities?
Yeah, well, I can speak more to this or give more details later, but I think right off the bat, the impact of agricultural pollution from these are large scale farms, I'm pretty sure, is that they release a lot of nutrients and bacteria into the water. And as I said, a lot of farm workers live really close to farms and these areas where they don't have access to like city water systems, and so they rely on wells, which if you are really close to the runoff from these farms, then the water that you have access to is contaminated. And so, that is decreasing water quality and also obviously poses a really big health risk if that is the only water that is available, that is more accessible for farm workers. But I think there are more details too that I could share.
Thank you. And someone asked about the slides. And yes, we will make that information available after the symposium. Thank you very much, Maritza. That was great.